For a century, they told us a story, a simple yet terrifying narrative about a planet running on empty. They said that oil, the lifeblood of modern civilization, was rapidly depleting. That was the reason for rising prices. That was the reason for wars. It was the inevitable truth of our survival. But that story was a lie. It was never about scarcity. It was about strategy. In the mid-20th century, the major oil corporations, backed by Western governments, realized a truth more potent than any oil well. Manufacturing the fear of shortage was far more profitable than pumping the actual resource. They were not looking to find more oil. They were looking to control the supply. They weren't fighting for national interest. They were fighting to protect their monopoly profits. This is the untold history of how the great energy crises of the last 50 years were not geologic accidents, but engineered products of high stakes, politics, finance, and an insatiable hunger for power. You think prices are simply a function of supply and demand? Here's what should terrify you. The system is designed to keep you afraid, and this time the lie is happening again. The central concept we must dissect is peak oil, the theory that once we hit maximum oil production, its output must decline, driving prices up forever. This idea, popularized by geologist M. King Hubbert, became the gospel for global planners. The problem is, while Hubbert correctly analyzed individual fields, his theory was weaponized to impose a global sense of impending scarcity that was not backed by reality. Our thesis is clear. Since the first major oil crisis in the 1970s, the global energy market has been controlled not by how much oil is left in the ground, but by decisions made in boardrooms in London, New York, and Riyadh. The goal was never to conserve, 'twas to reprice. Consider these two seemingly unrelated events. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, which decoupled the dollar from gold, and the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Both were leveraged to establish a new financial paradigm where the US dollar and oil became inextricably linked, forming what we now call the Petro-Dollar system. The fear of running out of oil was the necessary lever. It legitimized global intervention and the radical price hikes needed to power a new financial order. Let's see how this pattern played out across history and where we are in the sequence right now. By the early 1970s, the world was shifting. The US had abandoned the gold standard, setting the dollar adrift. Simultaneously, the Arab nations, through the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, were tired of selling their precious resource at dirt-cheap prices dictated by the Western oil giants, the so-called Seven Sisters. Following the 1973 Yom Kippur War, OPEC declared an oil embargo against countries supporting Israel. It was a decisive blow. But the crucial moment was not the embargo itself, but the reaction. Suddenly, the price of oil skyrocketed from about $3 per barrel to nearly $12. Gas stations across the US and Europe saw massive lines. The panic over scarcity was real. But the physical supply of oil had not vanished. OPEC simply needed to slightly reduce the flow, and the world reacted exactly as scripted. This was the moment producers realized their ultimate leverage. Scarcity could be manufactured. What followed was the historic agreement. The US pledged military protection to the Saudi monarchy. In return, the Saudis, and by extension OPEC, would price all oil transactions in US dollars and, critically, reinvest a substantial portion of their oil profits, petrodollars, into US Treasury bonds. The result? An artificial, constant global demand for US dollars was created, cementing its position as the world's reserve currency, even without gold backing. Oil scarcity became the financial foundation of US dollar dominance. Let's turn inward to the operations of the major oil companies themselves. For decades, these giants maintained massive oil reserves in the ground. Why didn't they pump it all out? Because doing so would depress the price. They implemented their own control mechanisms. Consider policies around drilling and exploration. Major oil companies were frequently accused of buying up large oil leases. not to drill immediately, but to prevent competitors from drilling, thereby maintaining artificially high prices and stable profit margins. This is basic economics applied to resource control, monopolization of supply. They were not consuming the resources of future generations. They were restricting the resources of the current generation to maximize immediate value. They used the strategy of controlled scarcity to manipulate politics and generate colossal profits while publicly lamenting running out. Reports on global oil reserves were often inflated or suppressed based on market needs. The real scarcity was never in the oil wells. It was in the information. These stories are not isolated incidents. They reveal a repeatable five-stage sequence of manufactured crisis. Every major resource crisis follows the same playbook. This is the 5 stages of the Great Resource Lie. Stage 1. The monopoly establishment. A small group of companies or nations gains control over the majority of the supply. Stage 2. The sowing of scarcity. Theories are promoted to create a public consensus that the resource is finite and running out. Stage 3. The engineered crisis. A real geopolitical event is used as a pretext to artificially cut supply, triggering an immediate price shock. Stage 4. The political trade-off. The resulting instability and high prices are leveraged to force new international agreements, such as the Petro-Dollar system. Stage 5. The repetitive cycle. Prices are maintained at a new, elevated floor, and the process is repeated whenever prices threaten to drop. And right now, in the modern world, we have already completed 4 of them. The modern world perfectly mirrors this historical pattern. Look at the recent European natural gas crisis. For years, European nations relied heavily on a single pipeline source, fulfilling Stage 1 monopoly. Then geopolitical conflict was used as the engineered crisis Stage 3 to cut or threaten to cut supply, immediately driving gas and electricity prices to record levels. But the story expands beyond gas. It touches on green energy. Governments are pushing a massive green transition. Is the motivation purely environmental? Or is there a more cynical motive, supply control? They are repeating sowing of scarcity Stage 2. This time, the scarcity isn't oil, it's time. We are pressured to transition immediately, which requires trillions of dollars in new investment. Governments and corporations are blaming war, and they blame the pandemic. But they ignore the fact that with technologies like enhanced oil recovery and fracking, proven global oil reserves are still vastly higher than predicted. The real scarcity comes not from the earth, but from policy restrictions and the refusal to grant permits for new development. Stage 4 political trade-off is unfolding now. Governments subsidize energy companies to stabilize prices, or strike new energy deals. We are firmly entrenched in Stage 5, the repetitive cycle. When prices drop, the major corporations immediately cut investment in new production, ensuring that supply will tighten again the moment demand picks up. Here is the terrifying truth. The people controlling the world's energy do not care if we have enough. They only care that we think we don't have enough. What happens if we continue to live under the Great Resource Lie? First, structural inflation. If energy prices are manipulated and held high, the cost of living for ordinary people will never decrease. Inflation is an energy tax imposed by monopolists. Second, permanent geopolitical instability. As long as energy is treated as a weapon instead of a commodity, nations will continue to use it for leverage and escalating every existing conflict. Third, total loss of trust. When the public realizes that the economic crises they are suffering through are being artificially manufactured to enrich a select few, trust in institutions will collapse. When empires fall, it is not because they run out of oil. It is because they run out of belief. The true scarcity is not in the barrels of crude. It is in the transparency and ethics of those running the system. They told us they were saving the planet. but they are making themselves rich by selling us a story of running dry. We cannot control the decisions made in global boardrooms, but we can control our understanding. Without truth, we cannot make informed decisions. Innovation can break this cycle. But that requires us to stop buying the myth that we are running out and start believing in the abundance of nature and the ingenuity of man. Scarcity is not always reality. Sometimes it is simply profit. Don't let this story be lost to history. Hit like on this video if you believe economic transparency is essential. And subscribe to Economy Rewind to never miss the truth behind the biggest economic stories. The world doesn't lack resources. The world lacks honest leadership.